Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We're back looking at another installment of 20th Century Boys. We are in volume 4 of the Omnibus collection, and we are looking at the first half. That is chapters 1 through 11 of volume 4 from the Omnibus collection, or the Perfect collection if you prefer, from Viz Media. This is an interesting point in the story. We are getting a lot of the exposition here that would be backstory in a normal story, but the way 20th Century Boys is constructed is filling in the gaps in the narrative. Essentially, when we moved from the first act to the second act, there was a time skip, and not a lazy one that you might do, say, at the end of a season of television or the beginning of a new season of television to create a bunch of mystery and plot hooks, although it does serve that purpose, but rather to push forward into a new stage of the narrative while keeping some mystery about the climax of the first act of the story in place. Except now we are getting the climax of the first act of the story told to us in full as a sort of in the place where the exposition in the first act of a regular story would take place. It's almost as if the second act is its own story, and the first act is the expository background for the characters. That is a deliberate choice on Urasawa's part. It keeps interest high. It keeps some sense of mystery and suspense in a part of the story that would not normally be quite as suspenseful. World-building exposition is not normally suspenseful, but by doing it in this way, by tying it back to the first act of the story, we manage to keep that sense of urgency and drive to these expository things that suit the tone of the story and allow him to do world-building exposition, telling us things about the political situation of the year 2000 in his alternate history, without devolving into a bunch of dragging exposition. Now, he does have to make use of flashback, which I know is a narrative technique that a lot of people don't like, but 20th Century Boys is constructed with a heavy reliance on flashbacks already. So again, I think this suits the tone and tenor and methodology of the story that we have read up until now. So I think it's a pretty good choice overall. So we start out, I guess I should note on the cover here is Yoshitsune. I do like to point out the characters on the cover here because they are chosen very deliberately, and they are important parts of the story in each volume. But Yoshitsune is not an important part of the story in this volume yet. So we're not going to talk about his character too much, but I do want to acknowledge he is here. And I believe as we go on, he will become more important. This is late 90s Yoshitsune, which is actually not who we spend the most time with in this story. But we'll get back to that. Again, he's not super important here. But I did want to drop that bug in your ear because in many ways, this is the beginning of Yoshitsune's biggest part in the story. He actually has a wonderful character arc, but again, we're not ready to begin discussing it. So we have to begin with our manga artist friend. When we left him in volume 3, he and Acho were preparing to break out from prison, and we pretty much just followed their prison break for the first chapter. It's a very good section. It reestablishes Acho as the coolest character in the story. He's smart. He fights well. But we have this flashback to when he and Kenji were kids, and they have this breath-holding competition in the pool. And even though Kenji cannot swim at all and is afraid of water, he beats Acho out because he has the courage of his convictions. And Acho remembers this for the rest of his life, of the importance of having convictions. And this becomes a lesson that he has to live out as he and his manga artist friend are escaping. And it is also relevant because they are in water. Holding your breath is a plot element in this chapter. It's a very nice, contained chapter to start out on because it helps us rapidly reestablish our characters, the tone and tenor of the story. and the sense of progress that we are working towards. We are escaping from a very dark place right now. And I don't know, as this was written, with it being the beginning of a new volume in mind. I know that the manga industry is pretty regimented on where volume breaks are going to fall in the publishing schedule, so I suspect it was written that way. And if so, it is a fantastic job. So our two heroes make their escape, and it does a pretty good job of establishing who is who and what their general attitudes are, and how seasoned and ready for life they are. And it also reestablishes that the FDP really doesn't want Acho getting away. He is the most dangerous person in the Kenji faction, and they put, as you can see in this shot here, they put a lot of effort into recapturing him after he escapes. But they do escape. They catch a Thai fishing boat, poachers who are working in Tokyo Bay. They want nothing to do with the police, so they don't turn Acho and his friend in. And they eventually make it to the mainland, at which point we see this. And we get a lot of flashbacks and exposition at this point that establish basically that the World Expo of the 1970s was a touchstone in the life of Acho and his friends. And we know that friend, the leader of the FDP, is one of that inner circle. We're still not sure who, but he was a member of that inner circle, and we know he has been obsessed with the past because he is trying to put into place this plan for world domination that he and his friends made. And now we see him recreating the 1970s Expo, and they're holding another World Expo in 2014 here in Japan. And so we really have reinforced here the notion that Friend is mired in the past, and he is obsessed with the things that happened when he was a child, and he really wants them to be relevant again. And that is an important bit of understanding our antagonist. That's something else that happens a lot in the second act of the story. We really begin to dig into the friends, not just the friend himself, but many of his subordinates, and get an idea of what makes them tick, what they do or don't like about the world they live in, and what they do or don't like about the things they have done to achieve the power they have in the FDP. We are formally reintroduced in this section as well to Kami-sama, the homeless man who was predicting the future for Kenji early on, except now he's not homeless anymore. He was sitting next to a man with a laptop in a park one day, and the man was day trading on the stock market, and Kami-sama told him to buy the stock you are looking at. And because Kami-sama is a little bit of a precognizant, he can kind of see the future from time to time, he predicts stocks correctly, and he very rapidly becomes wealthy. It's interesting, we're first told in the previous volume that Japan's wealthiest man has gone to space. That was a setup for Japan's wealthiest man coming back, and that is, of course, Kami-sama. And we get his actual name here. I want to get it right, because it is kind of ironic that his name actually has the word kami in it. Not that kind of kami, though. Okay, I don't see it here. I should have looked it up beforehand, but he does have a formal name, and we're given it over the course of this part of the story. But it's interesting, like all of the characters from the first generation, we do not see Kami-sama through his own eyes. We see him through the eyes of Koizumi. This is a new character. She's a new viewpoint character, and she's pretty important in a number of ways. But she goes to the same school that Kana does. But she doesn't actually know Kana. She skips school a lot. She doesn't know very many people at the school very well. But she's trying to graduate still, so she's trying to keep from flunking out of school. When she arrives late to class one day, when we are first introduced to her, she's in the middle, or her classmates are in the middle of presenting topics they are going to write historical essays on. And in a moment of panic, Koizumi says, well, I'm going to do my essay on Endo Kenji and the Bloody New Year's Eve, the terrorist attack that marks the climax of the first act of our story. And she doesn't know a whole lot about it, The teacher tries to discourage her from looking into this subject because it's very recent. There's not going to be any. It's not going to be on the exams. A lot of the details are still in dispute. All of these things make it a very poor subject to write a paper on, but she's determined. She's going to write it. And so the teacher says, okay, I mean, he can't really stop her. They do have freedom of choice in this assignment. But Koizumi is not the best student, so it could be pretty challenging for her. One of her friends, which we see here, and you don't need to try and remember her. I don't think she even gets a name. Not a very important character, but she does warn her that talking about Bloody New Year's Eve can get you beaten up because the girl in the class across the hallway seems to really dislike that. And that girl, of course, is Kana, Endo Kana. But as we know from the previous volume, Kana is on the run, and she's wanted by the police, not as a suspect, but because she is inconvenient to them. So she really can't come back to school. So there's not actually a meeting at this point between Koizumi and Kana. Instead, Koizumi goes to the Memorial Plaza and the museums there to try and learn more about Bloody New Year's Eve. We don't even see the inside of the museums. We're just told there's a lot of propaganda there about the heroic efforts of the FDP to stop the terrorist attacks. And as she's walking out, she sees a figure at the memorial eating ramen. And, of course, we know already that people eating ramen in that memorial are probably there because of Kenji. And that is the case this time as well. And the person who is here is Kami-sama, as usual. He's making weird bowling-based analogies. And he tells us he's there to mourn his friend who played a high-scoring game but ultimately lost because he couldn't nail the split. And as we can see, Kami-sama says it was a great game. He knows Kenji did everything he did, and he still lost. This is, I think, the kind of moment where Urasawa's storytelling really excels, because we see the conflicting emotions in this scene shown visually so well. I mean, there's no dialogue about the conflict that Kami-sama feels here, how he's mourning his friend, but he's still overjoyed that Kenji was able to do as much as he was. It's a very powerful human moment, and it's told almost entirely through the art, which is really beautiful. And it's one of the things that makes, I think, 20th Century Boys especially Naoki Urasawa's best work. Because he shows so much human emotion, so much human feeling, just through his line work and through his composition. It's really, really brilliant stuff. But that is the end of the chapter, and we continue on. We find Acho and our mangaka, and they are walking through a homeless encampment. Of course, Acho knows that this is probably the best way to contact Kami-sama. He doesn't know that Kami-sama has become the most wealthy man in Japan yet, but he does, he knows this is the place to go when he's looking for information, so he's going to lay low amongst the homeless. And he does get some information. He manages to put together that the cops are out in force and they're looking for a missing girl. He surmises correctly that that girl is Kana. And then we kind of leave them for a bit as we rejoin with Koizumi. And here she is. She's following Kami-sama around. She wants him to tell her a little bit about Bloody New Year's Eve. He doesn't want to because, who wants to talk about one of the most horrifying things you've ever seen in your life. But eventually, between Koizumi pestering Kami-sama and the mangaka trying to figure out who Acho is and why he's so important and why there's this nationwide manhunt, there's a lot of demands to know what the past was like. And it is at this point, around chapter 7, that we finally go back. We get one of the most iconic images in the series. The most one, in my opinion, is the picture of Kenji and his friends walking towards the robot through a destroyed city. But the second most iconic one, and the one you see a lot on covers, in fan art, in wallpapers, and even recreated for the live-action movies, is this one. On the one hand, we have in the foreground our friends getting ready to go up against the thing that menaces them. In the background, we have the robot itself. And this chapter is called The Truth. We don't get all of the truth in this chapter, but it is a good name for it. And it just sort of lays out what Kenji and his friends did once they were committed to the final battle. And it's not quite as cool as you might have hoped. They have a truck full of dynamite, but they're not quite sure how to deliver it. They know that they put together, or rather, Kenji puts together, that there's likely an observation point up high where the robot can be navigated by remote control, because that's how robots were navigated when they were kids. They cite several well-known pieces of Japanese pop culture, Tetsujin 28, and some other giant robo shows from the 70s, where that's how they controlled giant robots. And so they go looking for the control station. We get some excellent character moments here. The best one is when Mon-chan and Yukiji are driving through town. They're on their way to the FDP headquarters because Acho is headed that way already. He's pretty sure that there's something going on there, and he proves to be correct. But we do learn here some really important things about Mon-chan. He's come back from Germany to fight evil with his friends, and this is his last hurrah. Not because he thinks he's going to die fighting evil, but because he has been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he has come back to help out his friends one last time. And he confesses that, just like all the other boys, he had a crush on Yukiji when he was a kid, but none of them really wanted to do anything, make a move on her, because, well, they knew she liked Kenji, and they also didn't want to disrupt the dynamic they had going on in their secret base. Put your bros first, as it were. And it's a nice moment for a character who we really aren't going to see in the main body of the story anymore. He has terminal cancer. He's not going to live very much longer, and the main body of the story now is in 2014. He's long gone now. Mon-chan does not have long for this world when he confesses this, and he's been gone for a long time in the main body of the story. He is now essentially Donkey. He is a character we will only see in flashbacks. And finding that out in this way was extremely sobering, because even in the midst of all the crazy things going on, there were much more mundane but equally weighty issues that the characters had to face, and they informed how the characters respond to the big world-shaping events in their lives. Mon-chan saw the call to fight evil as a chance to do one last really good thing with a life that he knew would end soon. And he could be forgiven for being very selfish with the little time he had left. Just, leaving his job, going off and, living in a beach somewhere for the little time he had left. But that's not what he chooses to do. He chooses to take his time and turn it into an act of service. And that's very, very admirable of him. So we get the last three chapters here that all cover a confrontation between Kenji and the FDP. Kenji's faction is broken up into essentially two groups. You have Mon-chan, Yukiji, and Acho at the FDP headquarters. And they break in there, and they see that the FDP is monitoring everything that's going on. They think it's hilarious that there are people running, and they're burning buildings, and there are people dying. And I'd like to say that this is a cartoonish and cynically over-the-top portrayal of them and of the human condition and how they respond to evil acts. I'm not entirely sure it is. As I've gotten older and I've seen the kinds of really tortured extremes people can push themselves to, I am more and more convinced that, well, not every human being can become this kind of laughing, kind of almost demonic entity that laughs at suffering of their fellow human beings. I think there are some people that can get there. Honestly, everyone can get there, I think. It's just a question of whether enough countervailing influence exists in you to keep you from going there. And Kenji and his friends have a lot of countervailing influences, including one another. These people, unfortunately, don't. The FDP is, as I have said before, very much a cult that exists to tear all of those countermanding influences out of people. And it's pretty unsettling, kind of horrifying to see. But once Acho is in the FDP headquarters, he sees that at least one of their monitors is tracking somebody who looks like they have a remote control for the robot. And that leads to Chapter 9, the face-off, when Kenji, Fukube, and actually it's just the two of them that get there. They finally arrive at a building where the man with the remote control is. This man here in the mask, he's not wearing the friend mask. He's wearing a different one. But we were reminded of this character early on. Fukube told us there was a kid who came to the secret base in a mask. Sadakio was his name. And they think this might be friend. So Fukube and Kenji confront him. And this is a very important scene for the story. Somewhat for the character. Actually, it's vitally important for understanding Fukube as a character as well. Fukube and Sadakio confront one another, and Fukube has what is really just a monologue. It's just Fukube talking for most of it, and then Kenji asking a few questions and trying to prevent Fukube from doing anything rash. But we get a lot of backstory for Fukube that is illuminating. I'm going to talk more about it later at a more appropriate time. But eventually, Fukube goes over the fence here, and he wrestles with Sadakio to try and get the laptop away and steal the remote for the robot. And they grapple on the edge of the roof, and then they fall off. And as they fall, Fukube's last words are, "This isn't Sadakio," which is interesting. It raises the possibility that friend is still out there, assuming Sadakio is friend. Maybe he's not. There's a lot of interesting exposition here. Chapter 10 is just called Fukube, and we get some flashbacks to, earlier in the year, not like when they were kids, but earlier in the year 2000. And we learn a bit more about Fukube. And then finally, they decide that they discover that the robot is still moving. So whoever it was that Fukube fought with, and whoever it was that died with him when they fell off the roof, it didn't stop the robot. So they have to go in person. Again, they got a truck full of dynamite. They got Maro, they got Kenji, and they meet up with Acho, and they suit up, and they go up against the robot. And this last chapter and a half is kind of a recap almost. We go back to the moment when Kenji broke into his PA room. He played 20th Century Boy over the loudspeaker. And we remember, just for a minute, when these were kids that were looking to a bright future, one that never quite materialized for them, but one they are still trying to ensure that the next generation will have. That is actually a big theme here. We see Yukiji given the task of watching over Kana as the next generation, as the last chance that they have to win this battle. And then we see kind of how the leaders, the people who society in general trusts to set the tone here, we see them failing. Because we get a look inside the Japanese government. The prime minister here has his hand all bandaged up after the diet bombing earlier, a few months, well, no, just a couple of weeks, maybe less than a week before this actually takes place. And they have the opportunity to launch a military strike on the robot. They don't. They chicken out when they see it has a radioactive symbol on it, and they think, "Oh, what if it's atomic energy powering this?" Of course, it doesn't have a nuclear reactor in it. Such a thing would be far too big and too difficult for civilians to get a hold of. So the government wusses out. Maro, Kenji, and Acho are left holding the bag, and we reach the end of this part of the story when they arrive at the feet of the robot. And we have a final shot of Kenji looking up at this weird, bedraggled um, machine covered in strips of cloth. He just says, "What the hell? What is it?" Well, that is, the end of our recap for this time around. And it's a very important question because, as I said, the truth was chapter 7, but there are a lot of revelations that come down in this part of the story. And we are learning a lot about Bloody New Year's Eve here, but really, perhaps significantly, the biggest thing about this is that it's kind of a disappointment. There's no climactic confrontation. Kenji is not the one who chews out the mastermind, or what we are led to believe is the mastermind. This would not have been a great climax for the first act of the story, which is why it's not there. That's why we're seeing it all in flashback. The reality is Kenji had circles run around him. Friend was ready for just about everything he could do. And that's obviously why Friend is still in power in 2014. And Kenji is vilified as the leader of a terrorist faction. So, I really like this construction. And I've said that a lot, and I'm going to keep saying that a lot, although I'm not going to be saying it as much as time goes on. As I've said before, I think this story does fall down in the last 10-15% of the story, and even then, while there are some really great payoffs, not everything in the later acts are as good as what we get here. But this is still the story at its peak. It's still really good storytelling. It's fun to read. It's fun to look at. And as I've said, it has those really gripping, arresting, emotional moments that we see entirely through Urasawa's excellent artistic ability and his sense of composition and framing. This is an incredibly important part of the story because we are seeing the fruit of all the work that Kenji and his friends did up until this point. They didn't win the war. They didn't even win a battle. But they laid a groundwork for another generation that is going to take what they did, make something truly impressive out of it. And they themselves, while not quite the movers and shakers they once were in some ways, except for Acho, they are not as active or as physically able to join the fight as they were. They are still very powerful and important to this story. So we'll be keeping our eyes on them through the eyes of these young up-and-comers. So, yeah, I think this is where we see the best character work, the best use of plot threads, and the best payoffs of 20th Century Boys is here in the second act. And I know, as I've said repeatedly, the third act is shaky, but that is not the fault of the setups and the excellent work done early in the story. That's all I've got for you today. Let me know what you think about this part of the story down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit. I'll talk to you later.